Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Star Trek Strange New Worlds Season 2 Episode 6 Lost in Translation. This video is part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Strange New Worlds. So I have to start with a spoiler warning for Strange New Worlds up to Season 2 Episode 6. If you have not seen up to this episode, you will not want to watch this video, otherwise some things will be spoiled for you. So this was a pretty good episode. The plot was very reminiscent of like a whole bunch of different Star Trek episodes. So the plot was very ordinary and something that Trek has done. It's kind of a mismatch of stuff that Trek has done billions of times before. So in most cases, an episode like this may come off as boring or unoriginal, but the character stories are just really strong. Like the dialogue is so great, the acting is great. Like there are some really good moments in this episode. So I think that is what, and plus I think the character stories and how strong the characters were in this episode enhanced what would normally be an ordinary cliched plot and made it better. Which, to be fair, I think is something Strange New Worlds does a lot. It takes stuff that Trek has done before that it should come off as like tired and something we've seen before a billion times, but they managed to enhance it by telling really great character stories. So I don't know, this episode, the main plot of this episode reminded me of a lot of other Star Trek episodes from all the various series. The one that stuck out the most for me was one of my least favorite episodes. In fact, I named it the second worst episode of the entire Star Trek franchise, The Fight from Star Trek Voyager, because it's similar in the regard of, in this episode, these aliens altered Uhura's mind in order to communicate with them, and that's what the fight, these aliens were, who Voyager didn't know were there, didn't know existed, were altering Chakotay's mind in order to communicate with them. Now, in the case of Voyager, they were warning Voyager about the danger that they were in. However, in this case, it's the aliens themselves who were in danger, rather than warning Uhura about the Enterprise being in danger. So in that aspect, it was different. But the fact that the crew were inadvertently harming an alien life form that they didn't know was there, it was very reminiscent of episodes like The Devil in the Dark and Home Soil. And the fact that they went into, this deuterium, whatever, place to harvest deuterium, and it turned out there was a life form there that they were harming by harvesting the deuterium, reminded me a lot of the Cloud episode from Voyager, where Voyager went into this nebula that turned out to be alive, and that they were inside the guts of the nebula and they tried not to harm it. So and I think there's a few more episodes as well that it could remind me of. I suppose you could even bring up Night Terrors, which, to be fair, the fight was kind of a ripoff of Night Terrors. But the fact that the horror was hallucinating and having these creepy visions was very similar to Night Terrors. But I think there's even more episodes I'm not thinking of that, or maybe I'm just thinking of those episodes in combination. But I'm sure there's a few others where like they go into this nebula or something and find out it's really alive, and or like they're there's an alien species that they're causing harm to, and the aliens communicating with them to try to stop. Yeah, so that does mean this is very much like Star Trek. It feels, that's why it has a really Star Trek feel. But as I said, it's impressive how they straddle the line with doing stuff that Star Trek has done billions of times before in order to create this feel and make it firmly a Star Trek show, but at the same time not making it feel tired and just repetitive, like such like Enterprise, for example. Many Enterprise episodes, particularly in season 1 and 2, I think season 2 was actually even worse. No, season 1 had a few where they would just verbatim repeat plot lines from episodes from previous shows and add nothing new to it. And as I talked about a lot, those characters in that show, particularly the first 2 seasons, were flat and uninteresting. And so that's where the huge difference lies with Strange New Worlds, is that these characters are very interesting. And I think and so they do add something new. And plus, they're not just repeating the same exact plot verbatim. It's like taking a bunch of different plot lines and putting it in a blender and coming out with something that's cohesive. Like, I'm thinking of the episode Coda from Voyager, which is an example where they just rip plot lines from TNG at various TNG episodes and try to throw them together, but it's a mess and it doesn't work out. It feels jarring and it doesn't flow, where that's not the case here. Here, it's more akin to like one of my favorite Enterprise episodes, Damage, which takes elements from 2 of my other favorite Star Trek episodes, Year of Hell from Voyager and In the Pale Moonlight from DS9, and combines them in a very cohesive way to create something original. While this episode I wouldn't say is as good as that, because that's one of my favorite Star Trek episodes of all time, but it does the same thing of taking all these elements from various Star Trek episodes, but actually doing something original with it and doing something cohesive and something that really works. And so I think this episode explores Uhura's character more than the entirety of the original series did, which I have no issue with. I think I actually really like, as a matter of fact, and I don't really think it messes up with canon, because there was none established about her in the first place, and I think it's good that they're exploring her character more. I mean, Strange New Worlds has been doing this ever since the beginning, ever since they introduced her character, but here we do get a lot more sort of it's touched on more about her, how her family died and how that affects her, and just her, own mentality of not wanting to, of overworking herself and stuff like that. And I like the team up with Kirk. I think that worked very well in this episode. Now, when I saw the previous episode earlier this season, Tomorrow, I talked about how Paul Wesley, his Kirk, I just couldn't, like, in my brain, just couldn't I tried to imagine, like, William Shatner saying this dialogue, and I just couldn't make that connection. And I don't think this has anything to do with the episodes themselves. It's probably just my own personal journey of trying to reconcile Paul Wesley's Kirk with William Shatner's Kirk. Even though I was trying to make that same connection in this episode, but I actually had a better time. And again, I'm not sure if that has anything to do with the episodes themselves. It's probably just my getting used to Paul Wesley as Kirk. I had an easier time, even though I couldn't exactly imagine William Shatner saying his lines. But then to be fair, I actually could imagine William Shatner saying his lines. He would just say it differently, but that's okay. Because this is a different interpretation of Kirk, just like Ethan Peck's Spock is a different interpretation of Leonard Nimoy's Spock. I find Leonard Nimoy's Spock a lot more sort of rigid and unfriendly, I guess is the way I would say it, and a bit arrogant too. compared to Ethan Peck's Spock. And honestly, I like that Ethan Peck's more innocent Spock better. But you could also, you could justify that in canon terms of saying, well, this is just a younger version of Spock. Maybe as he grows older, maybe he gets bit more rigid and arrogant. And that's fine. Like, I'm willing to go with that. And you could say the same thing with Kirk. Although, with Kirk, the difference between Paul Wesley and William Shatner isn't so much as, I don't think it's something that could be reconciled with growing older the way Spock's could. So, I think that's what tripped me up. But I am starting to accept that this is just a slightly different interpretation of Kirk, and I can still, it's not so rigid and different, such as Nurse Chapel, which I'll get to later, that I can't connect these two characters as being the same character. I can. And I do think it does make a difference, even though the original series was a different show. They're still using the same characters, so I think, and they're using their same names, so it needs, in my personal opinion, it needs to connect in some way, shape, or form. Because otherwise, make new characters and don't call them the same characters that they had from before. I don't care if it's a different show or not. They're saying the name characters' names. Anyway, so I liked Kirk in this episode, and I liked how when he first met Uhura, she thought that he was hitting on her. I think this was a jab, or maybe probably a callback, but maybe I see it as a jab because I hate that movie. But it's kind of a callback to Star Trek 2009 because Kirk was hitting on Uhura, and when I thought about it, I liked how he kept saying, "I'm not hitting on you," because he's like, he's not as dumb as Chris Pine's Kirk, that he wouldn't actually do that. And I think the writers were aware of that reference. But I thought that was cool, and I liked her team up, and I liked the references to Tomorrow, where we see La'an. See, this is what I love about Strange New Worlds. I love the fact that they're episodic, yet they have that continuity in character stuff. And they do previously on as well, because this stuff is relevant. And that's something shows like Voyager, especially Voyager, in a lesser sense TNG, but mainly Voyager, lacked. In fact, some of the earlier seasons of DS9 kind of lacked this as well, but they made up for it in the later seasons. That sense of continuity, even if you're doing a serialized episodic television. Now, I do think that modern Star Trek or new Star Trek shows could do, I'm not against serialization as some shows can. In fact, some of my favorite Star Trek, such as the arcs in season 6 and 7 of DS9 and season 3 of Enterprise, those are my favorite storylines in all of Star Trek. And so I think that serialized storytelling, it leads to better storytelling in my opinion, but it needs to be done correctly, and so far Modern Trek has not really done it very well. They've had pacing issues, they've had problems with setting up the story as like this mystery box, and the resolution being not very satisfying, and that's been inherent in Discovery and Picard. But just because Discovery and Picard didn't do serialized storytelling very well doesn't mean I think that serialized storytelling shouldn't be in Star Trek, because I think DS9 and Enterprise proved that it should. But so the reason why I bring that up is because I want to make a distinction that even though I love Strange New Worlds and that they're episodic, like, I don't think it needs to be episodic. Star Trek doesn't need to be episodic to be good. And I disagree with people who say it does. But if you are going to be episodic, this is how you do it. By keeping that continuity of character stories. Even if each episode is standalone, you still have the continuity that Leon recognizes Kirk and that she's still in love with him. You know, TNG did do a little bit of this too as well. They did sneak it in there with like Barclay and then Q and stuff like that. But, you know, Strange New Worlds is definitely more consistent with that. It's not like when LaForge suffers, or O'Brien suffers, to get a DS9 reference, suffers a huge trauma and they say it's going to take them, you know, years to recover from it. In the next episode, they're fine. Like, that is something Strange New Worlds would never do, and I appreciate that. And so I like the reference. I like the chemistry between La'an and Kirk. I like how she still has this crush on him, but realizes that it's not the same him. And in the previous one, they showed that time agent telling her that she can never tell anyone about her experiences. And so I think that's relevant because she doesn't, because she knows that she can't. Yet she has this connection to Kirk, but tries to awkwardly find a way to reconnect it with someone who actually doesn't know who she is, which I find really interesting. And actually, I would like to see more of this. I would like to see them build this Leon and Kirk relationship. I hope they just don't abandon it, because I think there's something really interesting about it. And Kirk, as I said, is not hitting on Uhura. I think he truly just wants to be a friend, and he recognizes, I like how he recognizes something in her. Now, getting more into Uhura, it is very interesting seeing using Hemmer as the focal point of this episode, and it talks about how, and I just love overall, and again, this is getting to the continuity of Strange New Worlds that I love, that they just don't abandon shit. That this episode, a theme of this episode, is the impact that Hemmer left and how people are having a hard time getting used to Pella as the new engineer. And of course, we get that in the side plot with Number One and Pella. And that's eventually revealed where she says, "What is your problem with me?" And it's eventually revealed that's because she feels guilty for liking a new engineer, because she doesn't feel anyone could ever replace Hemmer. And with a horror, we get, of course, the zombie version of Hemmer, showing just how haunted she is by his death. And that is, to me, so I mentioned the episode The Fight. That episode is a total failure, by the way. As I mentioned, I think it's one of the worst episodes of all of Star Trek. And part of the reason why is because they said these aliens were trying to use Chakotay's own memories to communicate with them, but they did some stupid bullshit with like a boxing, which he's never been established to like boxing, so it just fell flat. Whereas here, they do something that we are familiar with, and that's something that would be really important to her connection to Hemmer, and they use that as the way to communicate to her that, hey, you're killing us, and sort of to make her feel the pain that they're feeling, and to put it in terms that she could understand. And I think, that's brilliant. Like, I think the revelation of this storyline was great, because I didn't get it at first. All the visions of like this weird zombie Hemmer and her dead family, and especially this scene when another version of herself was trying to kill her. I think towards the end, when they revealed that other guy who was like freaked out and constantly trying to disable the station and disable the ship's ability to collect deuterium, I think that's actually when I figured it out. That, there's probably aliens that are being killed by this deuterium. So I did figure it out before they officially revealed it. But I didn't make that was more through that other storyline with that guy going crazy. But the fact that he kept trying to disable that stuff. I was like, oh, that's why he's trying to disable, because the aliens are infecting him because the stuff is. And again, I feel like there's another Star Trek episode that's done this before, but I can't remember exactly. But even though, so I did figure that part out, but I didn't know exactly what Uhura's visions meant until she pointed it out. She was like, oh, this is, they're having me feel like showing Himmer, because showing me feel how someone I love being dead, and to relate to how they're dying, and having a different version of me attack me, because showing that I am actively killing them. I think that was done very, very well. As I said, I love how they're having Uhura watch the video with Himmer to do the engineering thing, and just how much he still affects her. Because I didn't like, and I was very vocal about this, I didn't like that they killed off Himmer, and I didn't like how they killed him off. I wish that they kept him on, but it's nice to get this sort of recognizing him, and not just being like, oh yeah, well, he's dead now, let's move on. Which is definitely something TNG did with Tasha Yar. So I like that. I like the reference, and I think it works on a purely character, a purely emotional level as well. Now, I guess I'll talk briefly about the side plot with Una and Pella. I don't know. I didn't really like this, but when I saw the side plot, I felt like, and this is a complaint I've had about the show overall, is that I don't think they utilize number one, or Una Chen Riley. I don't think they utilize her that much. I mean, she's billed as one of the main characters, but I feel like they focus more on other characters like Spock and Leon, especially Spock, more than they do her, and so I just wish they would utilize her. So I remember my first reaction to seeing this side plot was, well, good, at least they're giving her screen time. I just really feel like they don't utilize her enough, and they should utilize her more. She is, in fact, the first officer of the freaking ship. But the side plot itself, I didn't really care for. I mean, it was kind of humorous at times, when she was like, oh, you got crumbs on your uniform or whatever. And when Pella mentioned, when she said, oh, Himmer was one of my best students. Nah, I'm lying. I just said that because he's dead. He was actually average. And that's true to her type of character. And I think, but overall, I didn't really care for this storyline. I thought it was kind of cheesy. And I think the big revelation that Una was really upset with Pella because she's not Himmer was, I don't know. It's a nice thought, but I don't think it was particularly earned. Just my humble opinion. Anyway, so then, of course, we get all these meetings of these original series characters meeting each other for the first time, particularly with Kirk. Kirk meets Uhura for the first time. Kirk meets Pike for the first time. Kirk meets Spock. I think the Spock thing did feel like, I heard other opinions about this already where they thought, oh, it was very subtle and they didn't focus too much on it. I feel like they did. Even by because this felt unnatural. It didn't feel like it was like when he met Uhura or when he met Pike, it felt natural. But when he met Spock, it was kind of like, hey, you random guy, get over here. Let's shake hands because we need to establish that we're two friends in the future in this lore. See, it felt very jarring to me. It didn't feel as natural, and it did feel like, especially when they did a close up on them shaking hands, I was like, ha ha, you see, this is Kirk and Spock meeting. So I think they did, honestly, highlight it too much. I mean, I don't hate it, but I'm not they expect me to be all oh, this is when Kirk and Spock first meet. But I wasn't. I was just like, yeah, guys, just tone it down a bit, okay? I don't know. But anyway, I want to reiterate something mainly because it's a comment I read in one of my videos, but I want to reiterate something that I did mention in season 1 of Strange New Worlds, is that I love Strange New Worlds. I think it's one of the best. It is the best modern Star Trek show. And part of why I like it so much, I mean, it has really great characters as its main strength, and good storytelling, and all this sort of things I already talked about. But one of the main reasons why I like it is because it has a slower pace. It has a feel to it that feels more in line with something like TNG and DS9. Discovery in particular, and to a lesser extent Picard, but especially Discovery, was too sort of kinetic. It was too fast paced. This is something I complained about a lot when I reviewed Discovery, about how they spin the camera around. They had the people talking blah, 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 and the light shining in the camera. It has that feel of the reboots, which I hate. And here they don't do that. They slow it down, and they have like, you know, nice calm conversations, and that some people might find boring, but that's what Star Trek is. It's not boring. It's more reserved. It doesn't have to. You don't have to always move the camera in a circle and shine lights in your eyes for something to be interesting. If you rely more on the character chemistry, which is what this show does, that's actually way better. It's more of a cheat for the shortest attention span crowd to have the, you know, camera moving around like blah 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 blah, really fast talking. Where here they don't do that, and I was noticing that a lot in this episode in particular, that you had, you know, Kirk talking into a whore in the hallway as they were searching for that guy. Reminded me of, you know, Tom Paris talking to Chakotay while they were searching for the 8472 with the Hirogen in that episode Prey of Voyager. Like it has that same feel, that same reminiscent of the slow talking, and that's why I disagree with Red Letter Media, who apparently hates Strange New Worlds because they say, oh, they're too quippy and they're all juvenile and they all talk like, you know, they're TikTokers or whatever. I mean, I can see that point of view, but I think it's wrong. And because they're definitely more sarcastic and quippy than most previous Treks. But I'm fine with that, because I think all Trek needs to modernize. Just like I'm going through season 1 of TNG right now, and it's universally looked on as the worst season of Next Generation, and many people consider it one of the worst seasons of the entire Star Trek franchise. And part of that reason is because it tries to be like a 60s Trek. It has a lot of a lot of writers, a lot of producers who were from the original series, and even some episodes have the music was done by people who did music from the original series, and it comes off, and some of the directors were from the original series, so it comes off as 60s, which is out of place in the late 80s, and so that's terrible, and most people recognize it as a terrible season because it was trying to be like a 60s show, but it wasn't in the 60s, it was in the late 80s, and it wasn't until later seasons of TNG when they embraced the fact that they were in the early 90s and started acting like an early 90s show is when it got really good. And I would actually say the same thing for Strange New Worlds, that it recognizes that it's a 2020 show, and it needs to. If it tried to be too much like a 90s show, it would be just as out of place as TNG season 1 was. It's not a 90s show. It's a 2020 show, and it needs to be one, so I have no issue with them being a bit more quirky or quippy or, you know, whatever, and saying, you know, Ortega's like sarcastic comments and shit like that, because that's more in line with a lot of what's popular now and the style of the 2020s, and there's nothing wrong with that. On the other hand, I think that Discovery went overboard with the style, as I said, with doing too much of it with the kinetic and everything spinning and blah 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 blah. And here they tone it down a bit, but they still need to. I have no issue with them doing a little bit of it. Still being modern is because they need to be modern, but also at the same time not overdoing it and still staying true to what Star Trek is. And so that's why I think Strange New Worlds is perfect. And I was noticing a lot in this episode, so I thought I'd bring it up in this review, even though it's an observation about the series as a whole. But yeah, still. Anyway, so my rating for Lost in Translation out of 10, I'm going to give this episode an 8. I think I really like it. At first I was thinking of giving it a 7 because the plot, even though they did something original with it, it did seem really reminiscent of so many other episodes. But as I said, I definitely need to push it up to an 8 because the character stories elevated the plot. And I liked all the character interactions, all the nice touches we got with Kirk and Spock and everything like that. So yeah, I'll give this episode an 8. Now, one thing I did forget to mention, though, that I have to mention now, is Nurse Chapel and Spock. That is something I still have a problem with, particularly in this scene where they're implying there's actually a relationship between them. I must have missed this. I don't remember them being in a full-on relationship and they're trying to discover how they feel about each other. This is something I can't reconcile in canon. And I think it does matter because there are the same characters named. Now, this could have been easily fixed had they simply called Nurse Chapel something else. Call her a different character. And I fear that they're going to have to do some crazy retconning, obvious bullshit to try to get this to fit in canon later on, such as having their memories be erased or some shit, which to me would just be dumb. I just don't think they should do this at all, personally. That's just me. Anyway, yeah. Overall, I did really like this episode. I love the character moments. I thought it was a very strong episode of Strange New Worlds. So I'm not one of the best. I wouldn't go as far as to give it a 9, but still very solid. So I'll give this an 8. So that is it for my review of Strange New Worlds Season 2, Episode 6. I'll be back next week to cover the Lower Decks crossover. I've been looking forward to this episode for like over a year now. I'm so excited about this. I hope it doesn't disappoint. Anyway, so I'll be back to cover that, as well as I'm covering Star Trek Next Generation. As I said, Season 1 at the moment, one episode at a time, as well as doing many other videos on Star Trek and many other shows as well. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.